Hi, everybody. Welcome to our brief lecture on understanding the oral language development of emergent bilinguals. So through each of these slides, I will tell you a little bit about some of the differences between oral and spoken language, some of the characteristics of oral language development, and some of the things that we can do in our own classroom to support the oral language development of emergent bilingual. I think one of the most important places to start with is comparing and contrasting spoken and written discourse, because we oftentimes think of spoken discourse as something that's really easy, but we know that spoken discourse and written discourse can both be grammatically complex. For example, in spoken discourse, you can have hedges, what, maybe, this could be, or something like that. That's difficult for an English language learner to follow when they're listening to oral language development, especially when they're listening to native speakers speak in class. Okay, and we know that written can sometimes be very simple. You could have a simple subject, this class is hard, or it can be of increasing linguistic complexity as you write and include compound or complex sentences, etc. So it's not always written language anyway that's difficult. Spoken language is typically spread out. It is not always really compact or lexically dense like written language. There could be a lot of unpacked language. Whereas in written language, you may pack a lot of ideas into one or two words, or one word like a nominalization. Nominalization is basically when you use a form of grammatical metaphor. Basically, what you're doing is you're taking a verb or a verb phrase and you're making it into a noun. So, for example, if I were going to say, first one that comes to mind is pronounce, the word pronounce. You may say, how do you pronounce this word? The word pronounce is a verb, and then it can be made into a noun. What's the noun verb form, rather, of the verb to pronounce? Pronunciation, of course. And once pronunciation is nominalized and made into a thing, you can add an adjective to it. So it's now clear pronunciation. You can add a quantifier, many very different pronunciations, two pronunciations, etc., etc. Spoken language is also typically contextualized in that you and the speaker or the interlocutors, whoever's exchanging meaning, you know what you're referring to. For example, if you're face-to-face and you're in the classroom and somebody said, here, you could borrow it, well, you would both probably looking at a shared object, and you'd know exactly what you were talking about. When you write like that, you can't write like that, right? With an assumption of an assumed understanding of the context. It's decontextualized. So typically spoken language is less explicit and written language is more explicit. It has to be to make meaning. Spoken language is typically spontaneous. We're not, unless it's, we're in a situation where we have to be very, very careful about our words. It usually comes out what we're thinking rather than being well planned out, as good writing typically is. As I mentioned before, spoken language is characterized by repetition, hesitation, or redundancy, where valued written language in academic settings is typically to the point. So there are some factors that support the spoken language of emergent bilinguals, and I'll talk about each one of these in the next few slides. They are comprehensible input, comprehensible output, stretch language, negotiation of meaning, models of appropriate language, and a well-developed mother tongue. So take note of how these factors support or potentially support emergent bilinguals in their oral language development. The first factor was described by Krashen as comprehensible input. And this, like its name suggests, is not simplified language. It's not reduced baby talk, but rather it's a way of supporting an emergent bilingual's meaning making by using several techniques, such as the easiest one is explaining in a student's first language. If that is a language that is shared, you're trying to explain something, maybe that's a difficult point about content, and you both speak the same language. Spanish, for example, you could explain what that means. A second way to support comprehensible input is through the use of visuals. A third way is to build schema. Schema is a term from psychology that really means building background knowledge. So, if the more that a student knows about a topic, obviously, the more they are going to be able to talk about it. If they don't know the background or if they don't have the schema, they're not going to be able to talk about it. So background knowledge is not to be confused with intelligence. Oftentimes, if we asked students who are from the Caribbean or from certain countries in Asia, for example, to describe a day playing in the snow, they might have quite a bit of difficulty. Okay, but if we English language learners who are not from Asia, for example, and we're asked to describe an experience that was familiar to those students, we may find ourselves hesitant to be able to converse about these topics. Okay, comprehensible input also is supported by demonstrations and experiences and the use of multimedia techniques and texts, rather. We always want to be working at a level of input +1, just a little bit above and beyond the student's independent level. Okay, so input +1 is has to do with what is the support that we're going to be offering. It has to do with the support that we're going to offer that student in order to be able to make meaning comprehensible. The second factor is the converse of comprehensible input. It's output, developed by Merrill Swain, in which we're focusing on speaking and writing rather than reception. And we want to think about some ways that we can support comprehensible output. We could have things like language frames, sentence starters, or you could have activities where you have problem-solving dialogue, where the kids have to work together to be able to, as the name suggests, solve a problem together. The third factor that supports oral language development is the use of stretched language. And this is where we're pushing students to operate at an outer boundaries of what Vygotsky termed as the zone of proximal development. This is what the student can do. This is the zone in which the student can work between what the student can do independently and what the student can do with the support of a more knowledgeable other, in this case, either a peer or the teacher. Okay, and as we're engaging in stretched language, we'll see the teacher asking for elaboration through questions, or maybe providing some words or vocabulary that the students are stuck on. We'll have authentic tasks, and authentic tasks, sadly, are often missing in school settings. We want to get the students to actually do something that's not just meaningful for them. We're not talking about something that's absolutely fun. We're talking about something where they're going to have to find out some kind of, maybe some information gap that's missing. For example, if they're going to work together to, maybe there's going to be a new student and they're going to share a couple of the procedures for using the classroom library. So they would work together to create a short presentation about how to do that they would give to the student. So it's an authentic task. It's not for a fake audience. The fourth factor related to oral language development is negotiation of meaning. And this happens in the exchanges between teacher and student. Oftentimes, when a teacher or a student is asking for clarification, can you tell me more? I didn't understand. Can you repeat? There are there's opportunities for shared or co-constructed definitions. What does that mean to you? What does that remind you of, etc.? And oftentimes there's opportunities for collaboration and just an exchange back and forth so you can clarify meanings. That's the negotiation of meaning. Very important in supporting oral language development. The fifth factor that supports oral language development for emergent bilinguals is having models of appropriate language. Now, appropriate language does not mean perfect grammatical language, because grammar is really just about how we're making meaning, right? So it's not about rules and speaking perfectly. It's about students having the opportunity to use a variety of registers in a variety of contexts. No one speaks academic language as a first language. So we want to make sure that students have an opportunity to use spoken social discourse and academic discourse, right? And engage in using different genres, narratives and arguments, etc. And also, read and talk about and think about a number of different topics. And use the registers of science, use the registers of history or civics and social sciences, education, etc. So they can constantly be expanding their what Halliday called their meaning-making resources. The sixth factor is having a well-developed mother tongue. It's very important for students to continue to develop their first language. Now, if you don't share the first language with the student, one of the things you want to do is encourage parents at home to use the first language and to discuss the first language and give the students opportunities to read, write, and engage with family members or older family members and use their first language, because that supports the acquisition of and learning of the second language. How does that do that? Well, basically, like I said, if you have an understanding of the background, if you have strong background knowledge, if you have a strong basis, if you know the word in the first language, you're going to be able to transfer that word or transfer that concept to your second language in an easier way. So first language supports second language or additional language. Okay, just to wrap it up, when you're designing oral language development activities for your students, there is some criteria to keep in mind. You always want to make sure that there's a real need to talk. Don't fake it. You want to think about how to make an authentic purpose, and I mentioned that in the last slide. Give them a real reason to be invested in using language. You want to make sure that the task is embedded in whatever topic that you're using, talking about. We're talking about oral language development. If I gave you an activity having to do with, studying Russian history, you'd be like, what? What's going on? So it's the same way with our English language learners. We want to make sure that the topics and the themes kind of remain aligned. The task needs to be cognitively demanding. If it's too easy, it's boring. If it's too hard, you also lose them. So that's part of the art of teaching and what you know about where the students are linguistically from looking at things like oral language proficiency standards, etc. Everybody's got to have a role and everybody needs to participate. There should be an information gap in which everybody you can jigsawing some ideas, putting them together. You can think about, if you're going to study a particular animal, somebody could study their habitat in science, somebody could study their habitat, somebody could study their lifespan, somebody could study what they eat, et cetera. Do some research together and then bring it back to the whole group and share what they learned. So there's a general information gap. And of course, each of these criteria, you should be aiming to a number of them, okay? Hi, everybody. Welcome to our brief lecture. I think one